The night air in that glass-walled penthouse felt colder than the winter wind outside, the kind of cold that crawls along your spine when a truth is too big to fit in the room. I stood there frozen, the city lights glittering behind James like 1,000 watchful eyes. He looked nothing like the man I kissed goodbye that morning. No worn jeans, no oil stains on his hands. Instead, a dark, tailored suit hugged his shoulders, the fabric catching the soft overhead glow as he faced down my father. The heavy silence was shattered only by the low hum of the air system and my father's ragged breathing, each inhale sharp enough to cut glass. My mother clutched a designer scarf to her mouth, trembling. Bradley hovered near the doorway, his confidence leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. And James? James stood there, steady shoulders squared, voice calm, as he said the words that changed everything. "Mr. Hayes, I'm not just the mechanic you dismissed. I'm the CEO you've been trying to meet." The room didn't move. No one breathed. For the first time in my life, my father had nothing to say. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Charlotte Hayes, and I'm 25 years old. For most of my life, people saw the Beverly Hills mansion before they ever saw me. I grew up in a place where the marble floors echoed every footstep, where the scent of lemon polish drifted through the hallways long before breakfast was served, and where every moment felt curated for someone else's expectations. My father, Richard Hayes, built Hayes Capital from nothing but grit and steel nerves, and somewhere along the way, he decided he could build me too. My mother followed his lead like a shadow smoothing my hair, my clothes, even my voice, until nothing about me felt entirely mine. There was always an order to things in our house. My father believed in hierarchy, the way other men believe in gravity. He spoke in quiet, measured tones unless he was displeased, and then the air would shift tighten even when he hadn't said a word. I learned early to read storms by the movement of his right eyebrow, the way his jaw locked the single exhale through his nose. And I learned how to stay small, polite, perfect. A Hayes does not embarrass the family, he'd remind me usually while straightening the cuff of his shirt or adjusting the knot of his tie. From the outside, I had everything. A Harvard degree, a corner office waiting for me at Hayes Capital, a fiancé, Bradley Whitmore, who looked like he stepped out of a country club brochure. But the truth was quieter, almost invisible, like the way my father would place a firm hand on my back at galas, guiding me toward whoever he wanted me to charm. Or how he'd speak about my future as if it were already carved in stone. The first time I ever said I might want something different, he didn't raise his voice. He simply stared at me the way a man studies a malfunctioning machine. "Charlotte, darling," he said, in that soft, ice-cold voice of his, "your path is already set. Don't mistake your momentary confusion for independence." Even now, when I think back, I remember the faint citrus scent of his aftershave and the way the room seemed to shrink around me. Bradley wasn't much better. He was polite, polished, and utterly uninterested in who I was beyond my pedigree. When we attended dinners, he'd talk over me with a bright, careless smile. "Charlotte agrees," he'd say on my behalf, tapping the stem of his wine glass as if the clink punctuated his point. I'd sit there tasting the bitterness of the Cabernet and wondering when my voice had stopped belonging to me. The moment that set everything in motion happened at a charity gala my parents hosted. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers that threw gold light across crystal glasses and expensive gowns. I stood there wearing a dress chosen by my mother while Bradley droned on about mergers and acquisitions. The sound of his voice blended with the clatter of silverware until it became a single suffocating drone. My mother glided to my side, the perfume of gardenia heavy around her. "Charlotte will be taking over East Coast operations after the wedding," she announced to a circle of socialites. Her fingers tightened around my arm just enough to remind me I had no say. The women cooed their congratulations. Bradley beamed. My father nodded with that proud, calculated smile that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with legacy. And I stood there, skin prickling under the heat of the lights, feeling like my lungs were filling with sand. That was the night I slipped out into the garden, heels sinking into the damp grass, the cool air carrying the faint scent of night jasmine. I remember staring at the sky through the branches of an old oak tree and realizing the truth I'd been too afraid to say aloud. This life wasn't mine. And in the quiet of that moment, with the music muffled behind the walls and my heartbeat loud in my ears, I heard something else. Something I didn't understand then, but would change everything soon enough. A faint tremor in the air, like the world holding its breath. Because the real breaking point hadn't happened yet. It was coming, and it would shatter everything I thought I knew. I was 8 years old, the first time the world taught me that my voice didn't matter. I remember standing in the long hallway outside my father's study, the polished cherrywood floors cool beneath my bare feet. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, laying gold stripes across the carpet, like quiet warning lines. Inside, I could hear my father's deep voice rumbling through the door, steady as a metronome, my mother's soft laugh weaving around it. I clutched my crumpled watercolor painting in both hands, the paper still damp where I'd mixed too much blue into the sky. All I wanted was to show them. Just to see my father smile at something I had made. When the door finally opened, the sharp scent of his cologne swept out first citrus and something metallic, and he stepped into the hallway with that distant look he always wore after work. I lifted the painting toward him. My voice was small. "Daddy, look." He didn't even slow. His eyes shifted past me toward the staircase. "Not now, Charlotte. Grown-ups are talking." The paper wilted in my hands. My mother brushed past next her silk blouse, whispering against the air. The hem of it grazed my fingers as she said without looking at me, "Sweetheart, don't bother your father with your little crafts." I stood there as their footsteps faded, the house settling back into its familiar hush. The painting trembled once, then slipped from my hands. The wet corner stuck briefly to the floor before peeling away, and in that quiet moment, with the faint ticking of the hallway clock, marking the seconds, I learned what it meant to be unseen. And that memory never left me. It followed me for years, like the faint scent of lemon polish that clung to our house. Looking back now, I can see how that small moment was the beginning of a pattern, one that shaped every choice I made, every silence I kept. Growing up in the Hayes household meant living within invisible margins. My father didn't shout or scold often. He didn't need to. His approval was a currency so rare that even a scrap of it felt like sunlight after a storm. And because of that, I learned to chase it quietly, cautiously, as if one wrong move might make it disappear forever. Every morning began the same. The soft hiss of the espresso machine downstairs, the early sunlight hitting the crystal vases in the foyer, the distant click of my father's shoes as he prepared for another day of running Hayes Capital. My mother would sweep into my room on a cloud of perfume, floral sweet, almost overwhelming, and pull open the curtains with a flick of her wrist. "Smile, sweetheart," she'd say as she handed me a perfectly pressed dress. People expect a certain grace from a Hayes. Those early expectations sank into my skin like dye. Even as a child, I sensed the weight of the family name, the way it wrapped itself around every gesture. I learned to sit straight at dinner, to speak only when spoken to hide my disappointment when my father gave my report card a single nod instead of praise. There were small things, too. Moments that most people might forget, but that stayed with me in the quiet hours of night. I remember Thanksgiving when I was 12, the warmth of the kitchen filling the house, and the smell of roasted turkey drifting through every hallway. I had worked all afternoon on a small dish sweet potatoes with marshmallows because I wanted to contribute something to the feast. When I carried it to the dining room, my mother glanced at it, her eyes sweeping over the uneven marshmallow topping. "Let's put this on the sideboard," she said gently, lifting it from my hands and setting it where no one would reach for it. "Your father prefers the chef's dishes." During dinner, my father complimented the chef's work, and I stared at the untouched bowl across the room. The sweet, warm scent of the dish seemed to cling to me like a reminder of my place. That was the year I learned that effort didn't matter unless it aligned with my parents' vision. As I grew older, the pressure only sharpened. At school, I was coached for every competition, every interview. My father's instructions were delivered in a calm, measured tone, but the meaning behind them was always the same: excel, because failure is not an option for a Hayes. When I brought home a second-place debate trophy, he didn't raise his voice. He simply ran a hand down the polished banister on the staircase and said, "First place would have looked better next to your Harvard application." His words carried the cool smoothness of marble, but the sting sank deep. Around that time, I developed the habit of folding my hands in my lap when someone else spoke, tucking my thumbs under my fingers, a position I still fall into when I'm nervous. It's a small gesture, hardly noticeable, but even now it feels like the posture of a girl trying to take up as little space as possible. My mother's world revolved around appearances. She spoke in soft tones, her voice wrapped in honey, but behind each word was a gentle push toward perfection. She made sure my dresses matched the season my hair fell just right. My smile held steady even when my cheeks ached. She held me to a standard she never questioned, because in her mind, a Hayes woman didn't simply exist. She performed. I remember the Christmas when I got accepted to Harvard. The entire house felt warm with the glow of the fireplace pine scent drifting through the air from the tree in the foyer. I stood in front of my parents with the acceptance letter trembling in my hands, waiting for joy, for pride, something more than transactional acknowledgement. My father read the first line, nodded once, and handed it back. "Good. It's expected." My mother kissed my cheek, careful not to smudge her lipstick. "Make sure you thank the admissions board properly. These things matter, darling. No celebration, no hug, no moment. Just expectation." That night, while the house slept beneath the soft hum of the heating system, I sat alone on the staircase, staring at the twinkling lights on the tree. My acceptance letter lay in my lap, its smooth paper cool beneath my fingers. For the first time, I wondered whether achievement meant anything without joy. But I kept going, kept following the script they wrote for me, because stepping off the path felt like stepping into a void. Everything in my life was measured against their legacy, my education, my career, even the way I walked into a room. By the time I graduated from Harvard, my voice had become something fragile, used sparingly, carefully, curated, often restrained. Bradley entered my life when I was 22, and the pattern only deepened. He fit into my parents' world with ease. His handshake, firm. His laughter, practiced. His confidence, polished, like the surface of our dining room table. When he spoke to my father, he used words like synergy and acquisition, and my father nodded with rare approval. With me, Bradley was courteous, but distant. He'd place a guiding hand on my back during events, the pressure light, but possessive. I felt it every time, the subtle reminder that I was part of the picture he intended to paint. At dinners, he'd speak over me as if my opinions were decorative rather than meaningful. Sometimes he'd pat my hand lightly as though to reassure me I didn't need to talk. I can still recall the texture of his cufflinks brushing my wrist during one of those gestures, cold, smooth, impersonal. The sensation made something small tighten in my chest, but I didn't push back. Not then. I had spent too many years learning that silence was safer than resistance. And so by the time I reached my mid-20s, I had become an expert in agreeing softly, stepping aside, letting decisions be made for me. I told myself it was easier this way, that a life paved for me was better than the uncertainty of forging one on my own. But deep down, there was always a flicker of something else, an ache I couldn't name, a longing that caught in my throat late at night, when the house was still and the air carried the faint scent of lavender from my pillow. I'd stare at the ceiling and wonder what it would feel like to choose my own life. The idea felt dangerous, like touching a flame. Everything changed the day I met James. But before I can tell you how, you need to understand that the wound didn't start with him. It didn't even start with my father's anger when I told him I wanted a different path. It began years earlier, in those quiet moments when I learned to shrink myself to fit inside the expectations laid out for me. And the day I realized just how deep those roots ran, something in me shifted. Because the past has a way of echoing into the present. And soon, very soon, those echoes were about to reveal a truth I never saw coming. The note on the counter was still fluttering from the draft when I picked it up. The thin scrap of paper carried the faint smell of garage oil, and James's hurried handwriting cut across it in uneven strokes. Working late. Love you. I held it a little too long, feeling the pulse in my fingertips as the apartment hummed around me with its usual evening quiet. The air felt heavier that night, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something. When I stepped into the hallway, my phone buzzed, one sharp vibration that echoed inside my chest. A message from an unknown number lit the screen, its white glow stark against the dim hallway light. Mrs. Carter, come to 1910 Crestview Tower. Top floor. It's urgent. The elevator doors at Crestview slid open with a soft sigh, revealing a lobby too polished, too modern, too wrong. I could hear my own breathing bouncing off the marble as I stepped inside. A security guard in a navy suit nodded once and motioned me toward another set of elevators, these ones hidden behind matte black doors marked Executive Access Only. My palm trembled against the scanner. The machine beeped and the doors glided shut. The ascent was silent. Too silent. When the elevator stopped, I stepped out onto a floor bathed in dim gold lighting. Ahead of me, through a glass wall, stood James, his silhouette outlined against a backdrop of city lights, his voice low as he spoke to someone I couldn't see. He turned, and the moment our eyes met, something inside my stomach dropped, as if gravity had shifted. This was not the man I knew. Or rather, it was, and yet it wasn't. And then, the door behind me burst open. For a second, the sounds tangled together, my father's harsh inhale, my mother's gasp, the sharp tap of Bradley's shoes against the polished floor. The shock on their faces mirrored the shock rising in my own, but nothing prepared me for the words that came next. James stepped forward, straightened his tie, and said in a clear, steady voice, "Mr. Hayes, you're standing in my office." Everything inside me went still. It took a few seconds before I could breathe again, before the room steadied, and the moment stopped spinning. I had stumbled straight into the truth without even realizing I'd been searching for it. The shock rippled through me like cold water as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, what I was hearing. And it was only the beginning. For months, I had sensed something shifting in James' small things, at first barely noticeable unless you were paying close attention. And I was. His late nights, his distracted silences, the way he'd slip his phone into his pocket the moment I walked into the room. At first, I thought it was stress from the garage, or maybe a side project he didn't want to bore me with. But then the calls started happening at odd hours. His voice low, calm, too composed for a typical work issue. I remember one night hearing him whispering in the living room, the soft glow of his phone lighting his face. I had cracked the bedroom door just a sliver. The hallway felt cold against my bare feet, and even though I couldn't understand every word, the tone left a small knot lodged inside my chest. Still, I trusted him. I convinced myself to trust him. After all, trust was what had cost me with my parents. I didn't want mistrust to cost me something good. But standing in that office, the scent of expensive leather in the air, the low hum of hidden machinery vibrating under the floor, the weight of my parents' disbelief thick around me, I knew the truth was bigger than my imagination ever allowed. Because the evidence was everywhere now that my eyes were finally open. The first piece came when I stepped farther into the office, feeling the cool air brush against the back of my neck. On the massive glass desk lay a set of documents stacked neatly. They weren't garage invoices or supplier receipts. They were partnership proposals, patent filings, technical schematics, shareholder reports, and printed across every one of them in bold, unmistakable letters was the name Carter Innovations. Below it, in smaller print, James R. Carter, CEO. My breath caught. The pages smelled faintly of toner and something crisp and new, like the first page of a fresh book. The second piece fell into place with the screens mounted on the wall, each displaying graphs, market projections, coded diagrams. I recognized enough from my consulting work to know these weren't hypothetical. They were the inner workings of a multi-billion-dollar company, a company so significant that even Hayes Capital had been desperately trying to make inroads into its market space. The third piece came when my father, still pale, whispered, "This can't be real. We've been trying to meet with your board for 6 months." And the fourth, perhaps the most painful, the most revealing, was when James turned back to me with a look I'd never seen before. Not guilt, not shame, relief. As if a weight he'd carried for years had finally slipped free. He spoke with a softness that cut straight through the chaos. "Charlotte, I wanted to tell you. I wanted to tell you 1,000 times. But every woman I dated before you saw the money first, the company first. I needed to know you didn't." His words hung in the air like dust motes catching the light. The truth crashed into me in pieces, each one sharp. He hadn't been hiding from me to deceive me. He'd been hiding because he wanted something real. And suddenly, painfully, I understood just how much of my life had been shaped by appearances, by expectations, by people who valued image over heart. And that understanding burned through me like a slow rising fire. Because if anyone knew how it felt to be wanted for the wrong reasons, it was me. As I stepped closer to the desk, I noticed one more thing, one small detail that twisted everything into clarity. On the corner of the document stack lay a wedding photo of the two of us. In it, I wore my simple white dress, the summer sun warming my shoulders. James wore his rented suit, smiling down at me with that easy warmth I had fallen for. But what struck me wasn't the picture itself. It was the frame. A thin silver frame, elegant but understated. The kind of thing someone chooses with intention. The glass was clean, the edges polished, and behind it, reflected faintly, was the skyline of a city I didn't yet recognize as part of our shared world. He had placed it there deliberately, Among billion-dollar plans and industry-shifting designs, he had placed us. That was when another memory surfaced, a small one so small, I had brushed it off at the time. A night when I had woken to find James sitting at the edge of our bed, his silhouette faint in the moonlight, filtering through the blinds. He was holding something in his hand, something he tucked into the drawer, the moment I stirred. When I asked if he was all right, he smiled and kissed my forehead, telling me to go back to sleep. Now I knew what he had been holding. Not numbers, not projections, not secrets. Us. The anger came slowly, not sharp, but deep, like a tremor building under the surface. Not anger toward him, but toward the life I had come, from the life that had conditioned me to expect deception from sincerity and sincerity from deception. Toward parents who measured worth in contracts and connections. Toward a world where I had been trained to ignore my instincts. All at once, clarity settled over me with a quiet, steady weight. I had been living between two truths for years, the truth of who I was expected to be and the truth of who I wanted to become. And now the two were colliding in a way I couldn't ignore. When James reached for my hand, his fingers warm against my cool skin, I didn't pull away. Not this time. I stepped closer. I looked at my father, not as the man I had spent my life trying to please, but as someone who no longer held the authority he once did. My voice rose from a place inside me that had been silent for too long. "Dad," I said softly, "you taught me to recognize power. You taught me to recognize opportunity. But you forgot to teach me how to recognize myself." His eyes flickered the faintest falter in his breath. And now I continued, my voice steadier. "I finally do." The air around us felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks or a truth finally finds its voice. Because in that office, surrounded by the glittering skyline and the smell of polished wood and cold night air, I felt the shift. The old Charlotte had been shaped by fear, expectation, and silence. But the woman standing there, she was ready. Ready to confront the past. Ready to face the people who had controlled her life for too long. Ready to step into the truth, her truth. And so, with James's hand in mine, and my parents staring at me with a mixture of disbelief and something they had never shown me before, uncertainty, I made the choice that would change everything. I turned toward them and said the words that would carry us straight into the moment everything finally broke open. The room went silent the moment I rose from my chair. The soft clatter of silverware faded, the low murmur of voices collapsed into stillness, and every eye at the long conference table turned toward me. My father froze mid-sentence, a glass of bourbon hovering just shy of his lips, with the overhead lights casting a cold sheen across the table. I laid the folder gently in front of him. The pages inside slid open like a quiet blade cutting the air. "You should look at this," I said, my voice low enough to slice through the heavy conditioned air of the private meeting room. The paper's edge glinted under the recessed lighting as I pushed it closer. There was no ceremony, no raised voice, just the crisp sound of the first page lifting as my father's hand began to shake. My mother's breath caught beside him, the faint scent of her perfume punctuating the stillness. Bradley shifted in his chair, an abrupt, nervous scrape against the polished floor. When the sheet landed flat and my father finally saw the signatures, his and mine, his face drained of color. "You forged this," I said quietly, as every executive in the room went still. "You tried to move my shares without my consent." Gasps spread like a ripple on water. Someone dropped a pen, and for a heartbeat, the world held perfectly still. How we arrived at that moment took root long before the truth ever surfaced. The minutes building toward that confrontation had been slow and deliberate, as if each breath carried the weight of everything I had swallowed for years. Once the truth about James's identity cracked open in that penthouse, something unlocked inside me, a clarity that illuminated every shadow I had ignored. And once I saw those shadows, I couldn't go back to pretending they weren't there. I spent nights sitting at our kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet as I reviewed documents James had helped me request. This time, I wasn't reading them as my father's daughter. I was reading them as my own person, my own advocate, my own protector. Each page I turned smelled faintly of toner and age, the thin paper brushing lightly against my fingertips as the truth emerged in small, calculated details. Whispers of irregular transfers, signatures that didn't match my own, a trust account that had been slowly shifted toward new hands, and beneath everything, the unmistakable shape of my father's control stretching into places I never imagined he'd reach. The final confirmation came from a document James slid across our counter late one night, the soft, yellow glow of our kitchen light catching the edge of the page. "Charlotte, this isn't just oversight," he said, his voice carrying both caution and sorrow. This was intentional. It was a transfer agreement, one that would have moved my inheritance and the shares tied to it into a holding account managed by Bradley's family. The date on it was from months before my wedding. The signature printed next to mine was an imitation, a very good one, but not good enough. I stared at the page for a long time. The air felt heavy, as though the room was shrinking around me. My throat tightened, and for a moment I could hear my heartbeat louder than the soft ticking of the clock above the fridge. He had planned it. My father had planned everything: the groom, the role, the marriage, and quietly behind all that he had planned to take what legally belonged to me the moment the vows were exchanged. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was cold, methodical, disguised as guidance and protection. It crawled up from the past, spread through my memories, and reshaped every moment I once thought was love or expectation. And I realized something that a younger version of me never would have dared to name. He hadn't just tried to control my life. He tried to erase my autonomy. So I prepared, slowly, carefully, quietly. When he invited James and me to a discussion dinner with his board members thinly veiled as an attempt to mend fences, I knew it was the moment. He wanted to display me like he once had, to show his board he still had influence over the daughter who had run off. But he didn't know I was coming with truth. That night, the meeting room in the Hayes Capitol headquarters was chilled by overactive air conditioning, the scent of polished wood mixing with the faint aroma of the catered dinner set out untouched. My father began the conversation with his trademark confidence, his voice smooth as glass as he welcomed his board and outlined his plans for expansion. He didn't notice the folder I placed beside my untouched plate. Not immediately. The buildup happened over the course of the dinner, the sharp glances, the quiet tension, the subtle shift in James's posture as he watched the room, my mother's fingers twisting the linen napkin in her lap, Bradley clearing his throat, too often the scent of his cologne spreading sharply every time he moved. Then the moment arrived. My father mentioned a strategy dependent on future family-aligned assets, and I stood. Everything paused, and part 4 began. As I slid the folder toward him, the low thrum of the building's ventilation system was the only sound. His fingers hovered above the paper before he finally opened it. His eyes darted across the page, the muscle in his jaw tightening, the light reflecting off the thin sheen of sweat beginning to gather at his hairline. My mother leaned in, whispering his name with a tremor in her voice. She reached out, brushing her hand across the back of his arm, but he didn't answer. The board members began to murmur. A few leaned closer. Someone at the far end of the table adjusted his glasses, the light catching the lenses as he tried to glimpse the document. I spoke before my father could recover. "You forged my signature, Dad." The words struck the room like a dropped glass shattering on marble. A few chairs scraped. My mother gasped. Bradley's face went pale, his lips parting as if he planned to deny something, but he didn't get the chance, because James stepped forward, placing another document on the table. The paper landed with a soft thud that echoed like a punch. "And this," he said calmly, "is the email Bradley sent to your father confirming the forged draft was ready to move forward." The room erupted. Gasps. Whispers. Someone choked on a sip of water, the glass clinking loudly as they set it down too quickly. The board members leaned in as if gravity itself pulled them toward the unfolding truth. My father's voice trembled when he finally spoke. "Charlotte, this isn't what it looks like." I met his eyes. "It looks like you tried to steal from me before you cut me off, before you disowned me." He opened his mouth again, but I wasn't done. "And you didn't do it alone," I said. My gaze slid to Bradley. "You coached him to intercept my correspondence, delete messages, redirect documents. You even used my login once to approve a draft I never saw." Bradley's composure cracked like thin ice. Richard said it was temporary." "No," I said. "It was theft." The board members turned on them with a sound like a shifting tide, soft but powerful. A few exchanged looks of disbelief. One leaned back, exhaling sharply. Another shook his head, murmuring something under his breath. The power in the room shifted so sharply I could feel it like a change in air pressure before a storm breaks. My father reached for my hand. I pulled it away. It was the softest movement in the room, but it carried more finality than anything I'd ever done. "Charlotte," he said, voice hoarse. "You don't understand." "Actually," I said quietly, "I do. For the first time in my life, I really do." And then, with every eye on us, James placed one final page on the table, an email thread confirming Bradley had proposed a merger that would shift my shares into a separate holding account, giving Hayes capital majority control. Not one person spoke after that. The silence was thick enough to touch. My father looked, broken eyes, hollow shoulders sagging beneath the weight of a truth he could no longer hide. My mother pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her mascara already smudging. Bradley looked like he might be sick, but I felt steady, clear, whole. For the first time in years, I felt my spine straighten without thinking, my shoulders lifting, my breath settling into something calm and certain. I gathered the papers. The thin sheets rustled like wind through dry leaves. My parents watched me as I closed the folder, the soft click of its clasp sounding almost ceremonial. Then I stepped back from the table. The room didn't move, no one breathed, and I left them in that silence. My father with his unraveling power, my mother with her shaken illusions, Bradley with his exposed schemes. As the door closed behind me, the air in the hallway felt warmer, lighter, almost new. When the door shut behind me, the quiet in the hallway felt like stepping into a different world. The air outside the meeting room was warmer, softer, almost like it had been holding its breath the whole time, and finally exhaled with me. My footsteps echoed down the marble corridor, each one steadier than the last. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, matching the slow rhythm of my heartbeat as it came back to normal. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Something had shifted, something deep, old, and heavy that had lived in my chest for years. As I reached the elevator and pressed the button, the chrome doors reflected a version of me I hadn't seen before. Upright calm, no longer shrinking. That more than anything said in that room told me I was finally free. The ride down was quiet, the soft hum of cables sliding past like a lullaby pulling me back into myself. By the time I stepped out into the cool night air, I knew I was done living by anyone else's script. And in the days that followed, that truth began to take root. The legal steps were quieter than the confrontation had been, but they held a power of their own. James's legal team moved efficiently, their voices calm, their paperwork steady. Each document restored what my father had tried to take from my shares to my trust account, to the small investment portfolio he once dismissed as child's play. Sitting in our modest living room, I signed papers with a pen that felt heavier than its weight. The lamp beside me gave off a warm amber glow that softened the edges of the moment. With every signature, I felt a piece of myself returning. But the most meaningful reclaiming didn't happen in an office or with a lawyer. It happened at home. One Saturday morning, James and I drove to the little house we had bought together, a small craftsman-style place with creaky floors and a front porch that needed sanding. The sunlight that morning was gentle, drifting through the thin fog, like a promise. When I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and pine. The rooms were empty, except for a single folding chair and a bucket of paint we'd picked up on the way. James placed a paintbrush in my hand. "You choose the first stroke," he said, his voice soft, his eyes warm. The bristles touched the wall in a smooth, quiet motion. A pale shade of ocean blue bloomed under my hand, cool and calming. And suddenly, something inside me loosened. We spent the entire afternoon painting music drifting from an old speaker, the windows open to let the fresh air carry the scent of grass and new beginnings through the rooms. My hair stuck to my forehead, my arms ached, and the scent of paint clung to my clothes. But it was the happiest day I'd had in years. Boundaries came next. Quiet ones, firm ones. I didn't cut my parents out entirely. I didn't need to. Distance did most of the work. My father attempted calls at first, each one shorter than the last, each apology carefully worded as though rehearsed in a boardroom mirror. My mother sent long, wavering messages, her voice breaking between attempts to justify the past and acknowledge it. I replied only when necessary, my tone steady, polite, but no longer pliable. For the first time, every word I spoke to them belonged to me, not to their expectations. James never told me what to do, never pushed, never pressed. Sometimes he'd sit beside me on the porch in the evenings, the soft glow of the porch light casting a halo around us. He'd simply take my hand, his thumb brushing along the back of it, steady, patient grounding. And somehow that gave me space to breathe. The people who stepped forward surprised me. A coworker from my consulting job dropped off a housewarming plant, its soil still soft from the store. Our neighbor, Mrs. Rutherford, knocked on our door one afternoon with a basket of muffins that tasted faintly of cinnamon and butter. She told us she baked when she was happy for her neighbors. Her smile was warm, unpolished, real. These weren't grand gestures. They were small human moments. a kind of gentleness I had never known growing up in a marble mansion, where everything gleamed but nothing felt lived in. Work changed too. I joined Carter Innovations not as the CEO's wife, but as head of the charitable foundation James had dreamed of building. The office smelled of new carpet and coffee, the hum of computers blending into a low, comforting drone. I spent my days meeting young entrepreneurs, listening to ideas born not from legacy or power, but from grit and hope. Each time I handed someone a grant or connected them to a resource that opened a door, I felt a piece of myself rebuild. And little by little, I created a life that reflected not my family's blueprint, but my own. One evening, months after the confrontation, I stood at the doorway of our freshly painted living room. The sun dipped low, casting golden light across the blue walls, the white trim, the simple wooden furniture James and I assembled ourselves. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the rosemary plant growing on the windowsill. A soft breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the sound of kids playing somewhere down the street. I pressed my palm against the wall, solid, cool, real. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the fading sunlight rest against my cheek. I wasn't thinking about my father's disappointment, or my mother's expectations, or the years I spent trying to fit into a life that never truly welcomed me. I was thinking about the quiet strength that had carried me here. The nights I doubted myself. The days I made choices that felt terrifying but necessary. And the truth I found along the way that freedom isn't loud. Sometimes it's found in the quiet acts of choosing your life one steady breath at a time. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, James wrapped his arms around me from behind. "You okay?" he murmured against my ear. I nodded, leaning back against him. "Yeah," I whispered. "I'm finally okay." And I was. Because in the end, healing didn't come from exposing my father. It didn't come from taking back what he tried to steal. It didn't even come from building a new life with James. It came from recognizing that my worth was never theirs to measure. Life has a way of circling back to the truths we ignore the longest. And mine was simple. You cannot grow in a place that only wants to prune you. The moment I stepped out of that room, I stopped shrinking. And the life that unfolded afterward, quiet, honest, chosen, was the one I had been reaching for all along.